So I was thinking the other day about video games as a concept, because of course I was, because that's the only thing that I do, and I started thinking about compulsion as a concept in video games, because it's a really really important concept, obviously, in the process of presenting a narrative interactively, right? Like, if you don't have anything in your interactive narrative that forces the player to interact with your interactive narrative, then they won't interact with your interactive narrative interactively. And that seems really obvious. It seems really obvious. But years and years and years ago, I went to this summer camp where they would teach you, how to use computers or whatever, like software, and there was basic game dev and stuff, and it was Scratch, but it was fun. And one of the years that I went there, I made this point and click adventure or horror game or something, because like a week before I went to this summer camp, I played Antumbra, or I watched Markiplier play Antumbra. But regardless, I wanted to make this scary point and click game with like branching paths and cool like stuff, and like it was like subversive, and it was going to be all this stuff in my head. But what I didn't realize was that Antumbra forces you, it basically forces you, it really, really, really heavily cues you into interacting with the different stuff that you can do in on each screen, because it's a point and click game, and it forces you to get to a certain point in its narrative. And I didn't realize that it was doing any of that. So in my game, I had, when you beat it, it would loop you back to the beginning. It would put you back at the beginning of the game so that you could find these other really like obscure, cool endings. But I didn't do any of that stuff that Antumbra did. So nobody would ever find those different endings, because the way that you got to like the special ending or the new area was literally like click this square, this unmarked teeny fucking square in the first screen, and if you miss it, then it's just gone and there's nowhere else to do it. And that's bad game design, because of course it is, because I wasn't doing anything to actually get the people who were playing my game to interact with the other parts of my narrative. And it made me really sad, because I had this whole maybe like 20-minute experience, and 20 minutes was insane because I was 10 years old and that was like half my life. And then the people were playing like 5 minutes of it, and they weren't really getting it, and they were like, yeah, it's okay, it's fine. And I was like, no, you're not getting it. But they weren't getting it because they weren't even seeing the full story, because it was my fault. I didn't realize it was my fault, but it was my fault that they weren't doing it, because I didn't apply any of these design principles. I didn't apply any design principles, but I didn't apply any of these design principles that actually compelled the player to interact with all of the narrative. Because I didn't realize how important it was to construct a game in a way that actually gets people to play it, or what strategies people use to get people to do anything in any game. And not like, what compels you to play a game, as in like what compels you to buy it and then install it on your Steam Deck and then play it. Like, because obviously if you played Grand Theft Auto 4 and then Grand Theft Auto 5 comes out, you're gonna go, oh, I'm gonna buy Grand Theft Auto 5, unless you didn't like Grand Theft Auto 4. But if you like a game, if you like stuff, you're gonna buy the game and you're gonna play the game. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like individual things inside of a game that actually cause you to do things and interact with the game's narrative, the game's interactive narrative, which is the point of video games, that the game has to offer. And I'm also not talking about things like battle passes, the things that compel you to come back and spend more money in this endless game or whatever, because those are evil. Seasons and battle passes are inherently evil, and I hate them so much. And I'm not talking about those either, because I think they suck and I hate them. But aside from those, the most obvious examples of compulsion in video games are very simple. It is the game telling you to do a thing and telling you that if you do it, you will be rewarded. Like, quests. Quests. Open world games use quests a lot. And it works great for open world games because in open world games, it's totally possible that you'll spend like 9 hours doing something that, in the context of the game's actual narrative, does not fucking matter at all. And when they're making the game, they know that you're probably going to do that. So they know that you're going to want something to just open the menu and then you can see, oh yeah, this is what I'm actually supposed to be doing right now. And that's really the only compulsion that open world games need, is the compulsion to actually continue the story by telling you that it's a good thing to do most of the time. Because all the other stuff, like if you're the guy who's going to find all the shrines in Breath of the Wild, or if you're the guy who's going to play The Witcher 3, and then you're going to get really good at Gwent, like cracked at Gwent, you're just going to do that. You're going to do that by yourself. The game itself doesn't actually require a lot of compulsive elements, if any at all, to push you, the player, into completing them, outside of maybe like telling you that they exist and maybe where to find them, because they're optional and you'll do it yourself if you want to. All of the compulsive elements in open world games are just there for furthering the main narrative. Quest markers, waypoints, the Grand Theft Auto phone calls or whatever. That's all they need. That's all those games need. In PvP games, it's an entirely different form of compulsion, because a lot of PvP games, some PvP games, don't really have a narrative that is expressed through gameplay. The main goal of a lot of PvP games, in terms of compulsion, is to compel the players to interact with one another. That's what they want to do, because when you interact with another player, you're interacting with the mechanics of the game in some way or another, which is the game part of the game. And doing that by itself is literally as simple as putting two people into a room that they cannot leave, showing both of the players that they are mortal, and showing both of the players that they can cause pain. And every PvP game does this on some level, and it works. It works really well, because human brains are automatically going to think, oh, we can both hurt each other and we can both die, so I need to kill them first so they don't kill me. Because if they're dead, they can't kill me. And then there's an added stipulation that whoever is left is the winner or something. And then you have a system that works for groups of anywhere between 2 and like 1,000 people. The stuff in the middle, like building or slide hopping or Roman cancels or whatever, that's what differentiates the games themselves. But the concept at the beginning is all the same. It's the same concept. It's just you can hurt and you can die, and that's it. Some games like to add another layer onto this, where the actual objective of the game isn't to kill the bad man explicitly, but instead there's bad man in your way to do something else, like planting Tom Clancy's payload into the offlane enemy's Nexus Control Titan, and you are all mortal and you can all cause pain. And then you have a game that is even more fun, because there's more things to do in the game than just farm kills off of the guy who just really wants to learn how to use the Kraber on that particular night, which adds a lot of replay value and variation to a system that might otherwise become boring pretty quickly. Both TF2s and Valorant, bizarrely, are particularly standout examples of this to me, because both of them require the player to learn, above all else, the maps to play the game at like even a low level. And the games having different playable characters or classes or weapons within those classes or whatever means that once the player has learned the maps and once they've learned a character, they can switch to another character, because there are other options, which then once those are learned, they'll retroactively contextualize this map knowledge and the knowledge of other characters that this player has, which makes them have an easier time playing as and against that particular character, which makes for a nice, cohesive learning experience once you're past a certain point, which will depend on the game itself. Any single-player game with a focus on combat can also just use this same form of compulsion while replacing what would be another player with AI that can also kill you and is mortal. Katana Zero just starts off with a dude with a gun sitting on a roof. So you know that this guy can cause pain because he has a gun, and guns do that. And then a guy that looks like pretty similar to that guy falls out of the sky, and he's bleeding. He bleeds. So you've learned that both of these people are probably mortal, in addition to being able to cause pain. And then a ninja guy comes out of the sky, and he does some ninja shit, and he kills a guy. But they make you do the ninja shit and kill the guy. So you're like, oh my god, this is so cool. That's what you're thinking after you do the aforementioned ninja shit and kill the guy, which is what you're here for. You're here for the ninja shit and the guy killing. This isn't Dear Esther. You're not playing a game that's going to make you think about things. And then without realizing it, this game has completely taught you what you need to do without your knowledge. And those systems in Katana Zero are just in place to get you to interact with the combat, but it has other really interesting methods of making you interact with parts of its narrative, at least on the first playthrough, like really, really small and simple stuff, like making the dialogue options that interrupt who's talking to you red instead of white. Red is it's the violence animal color, so depending on what kind of person you are and how much you're willing to disregard social norms, or how much you need release from not having the balls to disregard them in real life, you'll end up taking the path that the developers more or less intended for you to take on your first playthrough, even though the options for the other paths are there from the get-go, from the moment you launch the game. And this unspoken interaction creates a really interesting choice for the player to make when they encounter Electrohead. That's the first big choice that you get to make, because the game just tells you to kill him as quickly as possible and do not speak to him. Which means that if you listen to them, you have to pick all the red boxes, which, again, is the violence color. So it comes down to who you actually trust more. These dossiers that you're getting from your psychologist, or a guy who wears a stupid hat. And it turns out that if you actually do choose to disregard the red speech bubbles over disregarding your dossier guy, you get a totally new path that affects the way that things turn out, and you get to refuse your blue crazy time roids. So the developers are compelling you to interact with both sides of these narratives at the exact same time, which is sick. Because Katana Zero is sick. Katana Zero is sick. Especially in the way that it plays with time. Like the part where they show you, I think his name is V, the guy with the dumb hair. They show you his mansion in advance while you're tripping out on the blue time roids, and then they just drop you into it later, because the presentation of that is super fucking specific to video games. In any movie where that happened, that same scenario, if that happened in a movie, the character who was experiencing it in the movie would have just realized that it was happening for the viewer, but the player actually has to make that connection themselves, because the part that you experienced while you were jumping around on the blue time roids wasn't the beginning of the area in the quote-unquote like real timeline. And then once the player realizes this, they'll start paying attention to where they've been. They'll start paying attention to the places they go in case they show up again, so that they can try to make sense of what the fuck is happening, because that's also the time in Katana Zero where it gets you to question what the fuck is happening. And in particular, it'll get you to think about Electrohead if you hadn't spoken to him up until that point. And it's a really good way to get the player to start thinking about their place in the larger scheme of this game's story. And I'm not going to come out here and say that this all really makes you feel like a Katana Zero, because I'm not on a payroll, but I think that it's one of the many innovative and extremely effective things that Katana Zero does to help immerse the player into the narrative. One of the other things is giving your character amnesia, because that's a reason to not give you a lot of information from the start of the game. And then it drip feeds you stuff about the world that you're in very slowly as the game goes on. And because of the fact that you basically started learning about this world at the same time as the character that you're playing as, because of its amnesia, who I would like to assume was intentionally made androgynous to make this process of self-insertion easier, you're able to put yourself in the exact position of the person on the screen. And as things happen and you learn more about your place in the world, you can probably assume that the character you're playing is reacting to it in the same way that you are. which I think is what games should strive to do. I think it's one of the things that separates them from other forms of media, either the ability to let players figure things out interactively or the ability to insert themselves into whoever's on screen more effectively than a movie because of that interactivity, which is what makes Hotline Miami so fun to play, because of the way that that game plays with time. Katana Zero drip feeds the information about the world you're in because everything is unfolding as you're playing it, but in Hotline Miami, everything is effectively predetermined. The game just jumps around from point to point in that fixed story to tell it more effectively by giving you events that have already happened or will happen or had to have happened this way in order for the story to go as it's going. And it achieves the same thing that Katana Zero achieves, which is allowing these new events to retroactively make more sense within the given context, like how Jake's entire storyline happens concurrently with Jacket's storyline from Hotline Miami 1 and before all the other events of Hotline Miami 2, but his levels are put at the beginning and near the end of the game because it makes more sense that way. The last scene of the third act and the last scene of the fifth act, which is the last in the entire game, happen concurrently, but you're playing as two different parties that directly oppose each other. And this method of giving the player an unsolved puzzle basically lets the stories for each individual character be told in a way that's more cohesive than the actual timeline of the game. Like how if the game itself were in chronological order, you would just be playing through Beard's levels at the beginning of the game because they happened 5 years before everybody else's stories. And then after this goes on for long enough, you get the sense that as the player and the player character, you're part of something a lot bigger than yourself, which is just what Katana Zero does, which is exactly the sort of feeling that you should have when you're playing with both of these games. And playing with time in the way that they do is a really effective narrative device that you can use as a writer to withhold information from the player outside of just not telling them something because they don't have a yellow key card yet or some other character doesn't think you're cute enough yet or whatever. And that can be a nice way to let a story unfold over the course of a game, but Katana Zero and Hotline Miami's methods create a real sense of accomplishment because it feels like you did it yourself, either by taking an intentionally different path to get more information in the case of the first, or putting the pieces together yourself in the case of the second. And both of these games are really compelling to play on a broader scale because of this. You come back to try to find out new paths and new timelines, or find new paces and dates to put together in your own imaginary timeline.